Hi, I'm Bret Juliano, creator of the Dust Bunny Mafia. You can find me at uh, dustbunnymafia.com, Facebook / Dust Bunny Mafia. I'm on Instagram and Kickstarter Linktree, and you're watching and listening to Two Geeks Talking.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Two Geeks Talking is an entertainment industry interview show where we interview the creative people from the comic, film, TV, movie, and video game industries. And of course, I'm your host, Kurt Sasso. We're joined today by a returning guest. I have lost count how many times he's been on the show, but it's always a wonderful conversation to have him on because I learn more about my heritage in terms of the Mafia than I've ever known any other guest to come on the show to talk about. Now, I'm not saying I'm part of the Mafia whatsoever. I'm just saying that I enjoy his conversation so much that we're diving into the true nature of true crimes on today's episode. Because we're joined by the ever-talented Bret Juliano. How you doing today?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on again.
It's good having you on. You know, you're not here talking about a comic. This is a first, which is fine. I appreciate you coming back here. For those that don't know anything about your past interviews that have been on the show, and for yourself as a geek in your own right, who are you and what are you bringing to Two Geeks Talking today?
I am Bret Juliano, the creator of the Dust Bunny Mafia, Mobimals, Vector Potatoes, and other spin-offs. Dust Bunny Mafia is a newspaper style comic that's like Looney Tunes meets The Godfather. I've been doing the comic for over a dozen years, have run about 20 Kickstarter campaigns in the past 6 years, 20 successful Kickstarter campaigns, I should add. Yeah, I've built a whole world with my furry animal mobsters, but I also love talking true crime.
And that's what we're here today about because you sent me or a message rather, and you wanted to say, you know what, I got nothing to sell, which is fine. I want to talk true crime. I'm like, great. I have not had anyone on the show in like 15 plus years that has talked true crime other than yourself. So let's dive into it. Let's have some fun here. What is your Roman Empire? You know, that meme where you always get stuck in the back of your head there. What is your Roman Empire, the true crime case or mafia story you think the most often about?
So it's funny because I've been using, and I know a lot of people right now with have some very varied opinions when it comes to AI.
Right.
And so I've been using ChatGPT as a brainstorming tool. I've been using it for a couple of years now, both in my day job, but also creatively. And I've been using it to brainstorm when I'm doing my Marvel's playing cards, coming up with new characters to add into the story, things like that. And I asked it to give me, the top, couple stories that we've talked about. And the one that keeps coming back probably has to be the Bugsy Siegel murder / Virginia Hill and just the whole life of that like early Hollywood, early Las Vegas founding. The mystery's unsolved. It will never be solved. We're, in like 10, 15 years, you're coming up on, 100 years on the case. So, all the people that knew anything about it are long gone.
It's that whole dead man tells no tales type thing.
Yeah. And it's just like there's too many unknowns, like Hoffa, like, a million other stories. There's we're never gonna know.
We want to know, but we will never know. Yeah, it's
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest ones that keeps coming up in my stories. I keep trying to work different angles and bring it up in my characters and replay things. But yeah, that and Prohibition are
right.
probably like because there's so many ties, and like that's how, the Mafia really got its footing
Yeah.
in history.
Who knew alcohol was the cause of and solution to all of life's problems?
It's funny because so as you know, I'm planning a trip up into your area,
Oh,
not going to Toronto this time, but we're gonna head to Montreal and Quebec City and
nice.
Halifax later this summer. And as I'm planning our itinerary, I threw in there's a mob tour in Montreal, and it's talking about the Prohibition era and how big they were in funneling alcohol into the US. And my wife goes, yeah, 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 makes sense itinerary wise. And she's like, really? And it wasn't a like, are you kidding me? It's more like, of course you would. You'd find a way to, find a mob tour even in Canada. And
I have to ask this before I go on to my other questions. Windsor, Ontario obviously has Canadian Club and Hiram Walker's. It has I think they still have the tour where you can go down into the basement where I'm sure Al Capone was there and everything like that. There's still bullet holes, I think, in the wall. I've never actually done the full tour of it because I just was interested in the alcohol. But if you're driving up this way or whatever and you happen to drive through the corridor, you should probably take that as a quick tour if it's open.
yeah, I'll
Add it to the list.
see if we can. We're flying,
Oh,
so I don't think it'll work for this time, but
well, keep it in the back of your mind there.
yeah.
Obviously, true crime is such a broad topic. You have a wide interest in it here, and we've asked and we've talked about this at great length. And I love hearing your stories and hearing how you research things here. But if you had to introduce someone to the world of mafia true crime, what's one book, one documentary, and one podcast you would share with them that they should watch, listen, and read?
So the one book by far would be the book Five Families by Selwyn Rabb. He was a New York Times true crime reporter for a long time, and he built the Mafia Bible when it comes to the New York crime families. So there's this 800-page behemoth of a book that goes through the late 1800s into like the 1990s and gives a huge timeline, and it's pretty much the Mafia Bible when it comes to New York City and the Italian American mob. Well, for the podcast, I would say Gangland Wire by Gary Jenkins. That's a very popular true crime podcast. It's been running for probably close to 10 years now, if not longer. Gary Jenkins is a retired Kansas City detective who worked organized crime. He's a lawyer, and he actually was involved in some of the busts and investigative work when it came to dealing with some of the Las Vegas casino skim in the 70s. And so he helped work the Kansas City side of the skim trial and investigation.
That must have been a huge undertaking. I'm sure man hours and all that time and research. Geez.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's got stories. And so, yeah, now he's happily retired and does this true crime podcast and brings on all sorts of guests and, from both the other law enforcement side and,
Yeah.
obviously the criminal side.
But there must have been documentaries as well too. I'm trying to think of if any have kind of come up because the books are great. I'm sure there's like made for TV movies that have been done over the organized crime aspects there. Netflix, I'm sure, has done a whole bunch of stuff too. But has anyone really dived into like the documentary side of like the mafia?
There's a few. Actually, interestingly enough, Sammy the Bull Gravano just came out with a documentary expose kind of a thing talking about his time when he was running the ecstasy ring in Arizona in the early 2000s after he was supposed to be in witness protection. That was the most recent one. That was an interesting, not fully mob. It was more like street gangs and club scene with drugs, obviously. But a lot of these books, they'll try and kind of repurpose the content into different ones. Like there was one that was talking about mafia spies. I think it was a Paramount Plus 6-part documentary earlier in came out last year, I believe, in which it talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything around that with Castro, JFK, Sam Giancana, the CIA, and the Kennedys and everything. And so that was a 6-part miniseries that was based on a book, but they brought in a bunch of true crime authors and different people to speak about. That was pretty good.
What's the most surprising misconception people have about organized crime?
So probably the biggest one I would say is that, not all gangsters lived in the fancy houses, drove the fancy cars, wore the $1,000 suits and things like that. Because it's like as much as people know about, John Gotti and Jimmy Hoffa and, the bosses and things like that, there's so many other little guys, middle manager type roles that those people, they're just scraping to get by. They're living in, if you're in New York City, you're living in a little apartment or a house that's been, multiple families, multiple generations are in the same compound or unit. Living in Chicago, I used to live in Oak Park, which was one of the big places that the Chicago mob lived. And you go by some of these houses, you have some of the bosses and people that have very nice houses, and then you go by and there's like Sam Giancana's house is a little bungalow, and it's a normal Chicago bungalow, like single floor. It's got a basement, but it's not this giant rich mansion kind of thing. And he was an outfit boss for 10, 15 years, something like that.
Never got a chance to really travel around Chicago when I would go to the Comic Cons. So it'd be like up and down the Michigan Mile or whatever, and then that'd be about it. Great food, but I never got to dive into the history of Chicago like I'm sure you've had a chance to do for many years there. There's got to be other like haunts around Chicago, especially over the decades. Did like the mafia move from area to area? Did they like kind of like spread out? Like how did Chicago get kind of like taken over by the mafia?
During the early times, it was definitely downtown or South Loop area during the days of, Capone and the O'Banion gang and things like that. It was very much central to downtown. Some of the location of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is actually just like less than half a block away from the Lincoln Park Zoo, which is the main zoo downtown. I mean, it's a parking lot now, but the actual spot is right next to this it's centered to downtown. Capone's childhood home was South Loop area, but they did a lot of business in Cicero, which was one of the first suburbs to the south side outside of the Chicago city limits. But then as things kind of progressed, like I said earlier, I lived in Oak Park, which was the first suburb on the western border of Chicago, and it's about 6 miles from downtown. And then as things progressed, and after the reign of Capone, when it came to Giancana, Tony Accardo, people like that, they lived in Oak Park and River Forest, and it kind of moved out west a bit more. You originally had like the Little Italy near downtown that was maybe a mile or two away, and then you started going out west more to get out of the city limits of Chicago, and so they were living in these other suburbs, but then working or doing their business in the actual downtown and areas of Chicago. So it was definitely a separation of business and personal.
You mentioned about the more lower level people in the mafia in terms of like housing and things like that, but what's a lesser known mobster or crime figure that deserves a deeper dive and why?
One of the ones that I found really interesting is Roy DeMeo. He hasn't been talked about much. There's been books and stuff for the true crime community. The general public probably doesn't know a ton about him. He was a New York mobster, and he had a crew of about 20 associates, and he is attributed to have killed over 200 people. And he was a butcher's apprentice. He was known for, he had learned from being a butcher's apprentice how to dismember. And he came up with, they called it the Gemini method. Gemini was the social club that him and his associates hung out at. And basically, they learned how to string up a body after they were done with them, drain them like they were an animal, and then dismember them so that there was very little evidence left. It's claimed that he took part in over 200 killings. Yeah, that's definitely one. I mean, like I said, if you're into the true crime community, you can find stuff on him, and there's a couple books, but he doesn't have the notoriety as, even in like, I feel like the serial killer genre doesn't have, yeah, there's, Jeffrey Dahmer and people like that, or Zodiac Killer, and, but
Because we have a lot of authors that are telling these stories and a lot of research goes into it here, is there a bizarre or absurd true crime story that you've just come across by happenstance?
The biggest one that was probably the most bizarre would be the Iceman or Richard Kuklinski. Um, there was a very well-known true crime author who basically interviewed this guy and wrote a book on him. And he was a very good investigative reporter, the author was. But the Iceman claimed to be a hitman for hire for the New York mob. And he had this, 200 page, 300 page book written about these torturing methods that he would do in New York and where he would abduct people. And then he was a very large gentleman. And so he would get his victims and bring them out to remote areas, like you'd go to the hiking and go into the wilderness and then find a cave and basically like tie them up and leave them there. And one such story talked about him basically leaving food on the victim while being tied up so that the animals would come and basically eat them. After doing further research, it turns out that a lot of people in the true crime community believe that he was just all talk and probably did some little things, but if he was a hitman, he wasn't a legitimate one, and he never really worked for the families and stuff. It was just a lot of talk.
So he'd be more in the serial killer community, possibly.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
If he did anything.
Yeah. Right. If you could get an honest answer, and I know that's difficult, from any mafia figure, living or dead, who would it be and what would you ask?
Well, I mean, the one that comes to mind immediately is what happened to Hoffa.
Yeah.
Like what really happened in those couple hours after he left the Marcus Red Fox restaurant. Or it would be, was there anything truly with the FBI, CIA, Kennedy, and that whole Castro? Because, they're trying to, Trump is releasing information or supposedly released more information about the Kennedy assassination. And that is still from my true crime friends who are more into that type of research. They basically said it's the same things. The documents that came out this time are, only slightly less redacted than the last batch, but there's still not enough answers. And a year ago, I went to the JFK Museum in Dallas, and there's been investigations for years, and there was thousands of, they had whole like 80 volumes of different big documents and big books relating to the different investigations, and there's still no concrete answers.
A page missing here or there, completely changes the story. What's the most overrated and underrated true crime podcast or show out there? I know you mentioned a good one earlier on, but is there any different ones?
There's a couple of good podcasts when it comes to Las Vegas. The Mob Museum out of Las Vegas put out a series that was Fight for Las Vegas, and it's in collaboration or in partnership. So it's the Mob Museum and the Las Vegas Review Journal, and they talk about the foundation of Las Vegas in the modern terms with the different skimming operations, Tony the Ant Spilatro, Lefty Rosenthal, people like that. Basically, the fictionalized version of Casino. So they dive into the real side of that. Then the Mob Museum also has another podcast they've recently started putting out, and they have a couple of FBI and undercover people that they've brought on, and so they do a good job just producing material and also bringing in reputable sources for it.
Any overrated ones?
Oh yeah, so there's a semi-well-known actor, Gianni Russo. He played a small part in The Godfather. I believe he may have played the singer Fontaine character, if I remember correctly. But he's had a lot of, so he does a podcast, he's done all sorts of interviews, and basically he has a lot of stories, and he talks about certain things, and as the true crime community follows it, he has a lot to say, but his stories don't make a lot of sense. But he's got, I was this in The Godfather, therefore I have acting credibility. If you actually start to listen to his stories and do a little research on your own, you realize that he's making a lot of stuff up, or these things are blurring the lines.
Everything has a supposed grain of truth, right?
Yeah, I picked up his book from a library book sale a year or two ago, and it was like $2 or something. I mean, all the books were. And I said something to one of my friends in the true crime community, and they're like, "That's a waste of $2." And I'm like, "Okay, we'll see." But for $2, I figured.
Yeah, worst case, it can level out your coffee table.
Yep, firewood in case it gets cold.
Exactly. Yeah, Chicago winters are brutal. How has studying organized crime changed the way you view power structures in everyday life?
There's definitely a lot of things, especially living in Chicago, that I've noticed. Just like the way they wanted to build. If you look at the old Sicilian organized crime, it was very family oriented. They were trying to be protectors of the city and everything like that. And then when you get to America, there's kind of a shift in values. And then they start, during the time of like Lucky Luciano and people like that, they start viewing it more as a business and trying to make money. It's less about, I mean, you're still wanting, they wanted the power, they wanted the prestige, they wanted to run things like a business, make it, even if it wasn't legitimate. And it's just interesting seeing the way, certain businesses operate. Also, being in Chicago, there was a lot of time where the Chicago mob had worked with the government to do certain things to get, certain people elected or to just keep things moving. And then there's been a significant period of time where the mob is no longer active in Chicago, doing day-to-day life and knowing that, there are certain things where it's like, I have coworkers and bosses and people who have lived here their entire lives, and they're like, things used to be so much easier to get things done around here when you could just, hand someone 100 and, palm them some money and things got done. Or I don't think I would get that kind of appreciation if I hadn't lived in a city that had those ties for so long and been around so many people. That's one of the nice things about living in this area, and there's so much cultural history with that for my comics and my stories, because I go to events and people are like, I've got a story about when my grandfather worked for Capone doing this.
But that's got to excite you, though, being a creator. You get people out of the woodwork, out of the blue, just coming up saying, here's my story, or here's a story, here's family history, tradition, whatever. And you just happen to turn it into a part of what you get to create as well, and what you get to learn and understand. It sounds like the true crime community is all encompassing and looking for the truth in any way, shape, or form as it is, but they're still enjoying the historical value of what they get to research and read into.
For a long time, I wasn't sure if my stuff, how it would go over, both in terms of like, I'm kind of the dying breed when it comes to the style of artwork that I do with the newspaper setup and different things. But I had a lot of this imposter syndrome earlier on in my career when I started doing shows and different things, trying to be accepted in the comics community and then also in the true crime community. When I first started doing Kickstarters and things, I joined a bunch of Facebook true crime groups and different things. I was like posting my, little strips here and there and just trying to get my name out there. And then the past couple of years, I've started to do a lot more networking with the true crime community. I participated in a true crime mob summit last year that was held in Vegas, and it was a ticketed event, and I was a vendor there.
Nice.
And I met Gary Jenkins, for instance, of Gangland Wire. I met him in person after 5-10 years of talking online, and then a bunch of other true crime authors and some reformed mobsters. And everyone that I've talked to, once they actually get to know me or see my stuff, I've had great opportunities. It's been a nice reassurance that it's like, I'm not just a fan of it, but like I actually do my research. I've got the podcasts. I've got over 120 books in my basement of true crime, and I've read at least 80% of them over the years, not to mention the other stuff I've consumed. But so even though I felt like, I'm just this little fan creating a little comic, like I said, there's also been, I've run 20 Kickstarters for my true crime inspired artwork. And so there's been hundreds of people that have followed my work and supported it over the years.
But it's good, clean fun. It's a good comic. You get to enjoy a bit of history you make it fun to read because at least you're doing everything like that when it comes to your long arching stories. The fact that you did playing cards as well was a great touch in terms of history. And I think it just goes back to you can have a career in what you're passionate about. And I think you've done extremely well with the comic and with everything you've created. And now you're going to conventions where it's not just comic conventions. So that's even better.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a passion, but it's also, it doesn't pay the bills yet, but I mean, that's the dream someday, and we'll see if I can get there.
If you could write a screenplay about a mafia story, which one would it be and what would be the twist?
The one that doesn't probably get enough love would probably be the, I mean, there's several. Probably the 60s through the 80s of the Mafia. I know that's a big gap, and I would probably do it in a way I would prefer to do something in the tone, less of a screenplay, because if you're trying to cram a lot of information into a, 2.5 hour, 3 hour movie, it gets hard to do.
Sure.
And so I always like the idea of a series,
Yeah.
even if it's a, 9 episode season,
Yeah.
or whether it's a limited time or, ongoing. But there's so much history in the 60s and 70s and even early 80s when 5 families of the mafia heads of New York get basically taken out in terms of jail time, not killed.
Correct.
Have to make that distinction.
Of course. Yeah.
But there's so many good stories in that time period that don't have a lot of focus. I mean, you have the big ones about Jimmy Hoffa in 75. You have the Kennedys and Castro and stuff. But there's so many other good stories. And my twist would probably be I would do it. This is going to be no surprise because my comics do it in my story, my form.
Yeah.
So doing animal mobsters or something like that. And basically, I would love to do it almost as a Boardwalk Empire style, except it's all animated critters, almost like, little shorts, Animaniacs, or different things where it's like half an hour or 40 minute, and it's like little 10-minute clips of showing different things. And then as you get further into the season, you realize that this story is connected to this story, and there's different characters that show up throughout. I'm reading a book right now that's talking about the history of alcohol in America and how, most people think of prohibition and different things, but coming from when the settlers first came to America, one of their big things was having enough beer on board, and then you have Boston Tea Party and different things. And you have this swing back and forth of drinking is wrong to, okay, this pendulum. But as I'm reading this book with nothing that I didn't buy it for the mob aspect, but there is a big chapter on prohibition. And it seems like a lot of the stuff that I consume has, ties to organized crime or different things in little bits and pieces to it, whether or not I planned to have that. But that's what I would want to do with a story, would have something that you have these different pieces and you set up all the different things. And then as it starts to build towards the end of the season or series, these things are all connected.
I think that would be an interesting, like 6 to 12 episode series would be interesting, especially animated. It'd be an interesting way, definitely tie in history. It really depend on the animation style you're going for too. Like,
yeah,
I mean, make 3D models of your characters and then try to replicate it with like 2D backgrounds. Yeah. Crazier things have been done.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like you have your next project to kickstart, as if you don't have enough already.
Yeah. That would take a lot of. That's something I don't have the time or patience to get into yet.
Or pull the whole South Park thing. Just, create your characters in 2D and just animate it stop motion. That would be a little easier on your time.
I saw a video the other day that was coming from Adobe, and they were talking about the motion. There's one of the things where they're talking about video, and they were showing a dragon and a knight, and so basically being able to animate something and then, oh, we need this turned, and then they turn it on the spot and it renders a whole different version. And I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I could look into that at some point, because there are certain characters where it's like I'm only drawing them in certain poses. But if I was to animate, maybe I could leverage that tool,
Nice.
at some point.
Do the two frame hop or whatever it is to get them to walk through, and you're all set. What's a true crime rabbit hole you went down that turned out to be a complete waste of time?
As I mentioned earlier, the part about the Iceman,
Right.
I had, done a pretty deep dive into this book. I found it really fascinating at the time. There were a couple of interviews done with this mobster when he was in prison. I believe there was a 60 minutes interview and some different things. And for a while, I had started doing, it was earlier on in my comics, and I was trying to incorporate that character into it. And then as I did more research down the road, I found out that basically he was full of himself and was just trying to probably make a quick buck, trying to get some, different things for when he got out of prison, trying to make some money for himself. And so, yeah, that was one of the stories that was like, well, wish I would have known ahead of time. Don't put so much energy into this story. And
It's a shame when you get to something and you hit a wall and it's like there's X amount of days, years, whatever. I can't get back. Is there a law enforcement strategy against organized crime you think was the most effective or the most flawed?
so the most effective had to be the RICO
Mm.
statute, which basically is the one that you can tie crimes together and basically say that people are acting as a group, and it was the way that the bosses and different people were able to be implicated on crimes that were committed by other people in
Mm.
their organization. The most interesting thing about that is that when that statute first came out and was written into law, it took almost 10 years for someone to use it with any kind of efficiency,
Mm.
because the lawyers at the time didn't know what to do with it. And they were like, how can you really establish that all of these pieces tied together? It basically sat on the shelf for, yeah, almost a decade before people started to use it in courtrooms and things like that.
Is there one that wasn't effective or that was flawed?
I mean, if you go back to the time of like Capone and Machine Gun Jack McGurn and things like that, vagrancy was a crime that was basically a way for people to say, "Oh, I don't like the way you're walking, looking, whatever. You look like a shady
Mm.
person late at night. I'm going to pull you in on vagrancy." And it was just like uh, I don't think you're really supposed to be doing that. I mean, yes, there are certain stereotypes or different things for a reason,
Mm.
types of behavior that people profile. But I think that in the early days was like, I just want to bring kind of a trumped up way to, I want to bring someone in, and I don't, they look a little off. I think they're a gangster or
Mm.
something. So we're going to bring them in for vagrancy, whether or not they're actually doing anything wrong.
When you get arrested 145 times, for vagrancy, it starts to kind of lose its luster, right?
Mhm.
Is there a mob related location you'd love to visit for its history that you haven't been to yet?
I've been to, well, the biggest one, I haven't gone to New York. I've never been to the state or New York City, and there's plenty of places in New York City, obviously, that I would love to visit, but a little easier for me to reach, probably, that would be a little less crowded and time consuming, would be Tampa
Okay.
in Florida. A friend of mine, Scott Dietschy, who is a true crime author, and he leads a walking tour of Tampa that is a true crime tour. He's written a book, Cigar City Mafia. So Tampa, Florida was known as Cigar City, and there was a big Cuban population. There was a whole mafia family, the Traficantes, and they had ties with Carlos Marcello, who was the New Orleans boss, and ties to the whole JFK, Castro, Kennedy's, and CIA Cuban Missile Crisis. That whole era, Traficante and that family ruled the basically Tampa area for years. I actually ran into Scott by chance in Vegas about a year ago. We were literally walking down the street, and I was like, wait a minute. I know you. And we weren't there for the same thing. And it literally just happened. And we ended up having dinner
Oh, wow.
later that week and stuff and got to talk true crime and everything. I've been to Tampa once, but it wasn't for that. And then it was actually before I really got to know Scott. And so I would love to take his walking tour and
Yeah.
see some of the sights of that. That would be a little bit more low key than trying to go to New York and cram everything in.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, there's your next trip then, after you finish this one. So it works out well. It's probably cheaper to get there too.
Hmm.
If you had to survive a year inside a crime syndicate, which one would you pick and how would you stay alive?
After doing enough research, I would probably do probably one of the New York families I'd have to set it during a period of like the 80s, 70s or 80s, and I would try to diversify. So I would not do the drug business, even though there was a lot of people, another one of the big misconceptions, they talk about not being involved in drugs, and yet a lot of people were involved in selling drugs and things like that to make a lot of money, but there was a lot of danger to that. But I feel like I've done enough research that, assuming I had all of my research ahead of time, still had that information. Don't get greedy and don't double cross your boss. If you are making those obscene amounts of money, tuck some of it away or go into a legitimate business. There are some other mobsters who had legitimate businesses who made a lot of money and lived a quiet, life at the end that weren't just, killed off or thrown in prison.
Surviving the 80s, it's a decade that many people would love to go back to, including myself. So, name three mobsters who were surprisingly good at a legitimate skill.
As I started to allude to in my last question, there was a mobster that was known as Joe the Cat. He got into real estate. So he actually in addition to his other illegal enterprises, he bought up a lot of real estate and ended up retiring. He retired from the mob, moved to Florida, and basically lived off his legitimate income. And he died a very wealthy and happy individual. Some of the other ones, there are a lot of mobsters who are very good at cooking. There were some that were very well known for their winemaking because you had such close-knit family organizations, both in terms of their like mafia families, but also their heritage. So, I mean, there's another one, Carmine Galante. He was known as the Cigar. He was a mobster boss of New York in the 60s and 70s. He was a tailor in his early days, and he actually did a lot with legitimate business in the tailor and seamstress industries in the, I want to say 50s and 60s or 40s and 50s when he was first starting out. And actually, a lot of his, when he wasn't dealing and doing the drug side of business, he actually did a lot with the seamstresses and the buttoning, different things, and getting union enterprises,
Oh, wow.
kind of getting people unionized for those different, yeah, clothing manufacturing.
What are two failed mafia hits that backfired spectacularly?
One of the big ones, Carmine Persico, goes back to the days of Crazy Joey Gallo and the Gallo brothers. He attempted to kill Larry Gallo, and that's actually how he got his nickname of Carmine the Snake Persico. They were a part of the same crew,
Okay.
and there was a war going on inside their mafia family. And so he attempted to strangle this brother as a way to kind of turn on because he was offered more money to go with this one side of the family as opposed to staying. He attempted to strangle this other brother. He did it in a bar late at night. It was an early Sunday morning, and a beat cop happened to walk in because he's like, "Hey, why is this bar open on a Sunday morning?" Saw lights on, came inside, and caught him mid strangulation. Larry was not killed at that point. It ended up being a blunder, and it caused a whole lot of other things that happened. Pretty deep ramifications came from that. The other one, the assassination that did happen of Big Paul Castellano with John Gotti and Sammy the Bull. I don't think that one actually did Gotti any favors because he became really well known after that. I mean, yes, he got into his, kind of celebrity status era, but it wasn't a real sanctioned hit. If he would have went through the proper channels and actually just kind of got the authorization from the commission to get Big Paul into retirement and just go up the natural way instead of actually attempting to assassinate him, I think it would have been better off for him in the long run. But
career paths are kind of difficult in the mafia, I'm sure. It's not like there's an HR you can go to, right? What's the most bizarre items ever used to hide drugs or money in smuggling cases?
one of the most interesting ones happened in the 80s, and it was called the Pizza Connection trial or the Pizza Connection, in which investigators figured out that the mafia was using American pizzerias as fronts to traffic heroin in and launder money. And they were smuggling drugs inside of tomato cans, or tomato sauce cans from Sicily. That's actually something that Carmine Galante was part of. Tomato sauce cans would be one of the most interesting ones.
No, don't use that one. That one has too much of a kick. No wonder Chicago pizza became famous, right?
Mm-hmm.
They just said it was deep dish. The reason why it's like 6 inches is because it has like 3 inches of heroin or which 3 non-mafia crimes, either heist, scams, or anything along that respect, or any crimes whatsoever, do you think deserves a Hollywood movie?
There's a couple of heists that I found really interesting. A couple of years ago, I visited Boston, and there's the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum heist, which took place in 1990, involved 2 men disguised as police officers, and they stole 13 pieces of art, including works by Rembrandt and Monet, and the pieces are estimated at 500 million. The heist remains unsolved, and the stolen artwork's not been recovered.
Wow.
And in the museum, so they actually took the artwork out of the frames, like they cut them out of the frames, and the empty frames are still on the walls of this museum. It's interesting going there and actually having some of the different curators and stuff will talk about how people will take pictures of the empty frames next to the other. There's a wall and there's one big empty frame, and they'll take a picture of the empty frame surrounded by the other, as opposed to the actual other pieces of famous art. There are theories that there is some mafia element to it, but for the most part, they largely think it's just a regular heist. And then one of the other ones, so this one actually it's a heist. It has some mafia ties. The Marble Diamond heist. It happened in London in 1980, and there were 2 Chicago mobsters. They stole a 1980s marble diamond from Graf Jewelers, which was worth 400,000 euros at the time. The heist was bungled, and then the thieves were arrested within 11 hours as they stepped off a flight from Chicago, but the diamond has never been recovered.
Wow. That'd be interesting. As long as The Rock doesn't play the lead, I think it would be fine. Well, Brett, I do hate to say it, but that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. It's been a great pleasure talking to you about your true crime knowledge, and I've learned a lot with this episode. I'm sure people who get to watch and listen to this in the future will learn a lot more too. So thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, as always.
For those that want to support you, of course, with your amazing comics and everything like that, where can they find you? How can they support you? And do you have anything else upcoming that you'd like to promote?
Right now, I mean, my biggest thing is I've got my online store at shop.dustbunnymafia.com, or you can get it through the different social media profiles. Just go to dustbunnymafia.com or search for it in Instagram, Facebook, things like that. I've got a Kickstarter page where I run about 3 to 4 Kickstarter campaigns a year for everything from playing cards to comics and graphic novels. You can find me there, follow me on the social media places, and thanks again for having me.
Well, we'll get you back on with whatever your next project is too, and that'll be a pleasure speaking with you about that as well. And I hate to say it, like I said, that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. You can, of course, find this interview and 1,200 plus others on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/TGT Media. The podcast you can find at Two Geeks Talking, that's TWO.podbean.com, or just search Two Geeks Talking wherever you get your podcasts. And as I say every week, everyone has a story to tell. It's up to me to help bring that out. Thanks for listening and watching on Two Geeks Talking.